Sit back, relax, and welcome to Reading Hours. Today's book is The Godfather by Mario Puzo. Please let us know in the comments from where you are watching, or if there is a book you want us to summarize in future. Amerigo Bonasera sat in the New York criminal court, waiting for justice. He had lived in America for nearly 40 years, believing in the promise of this country, trusting in its laws. But when his daughter was attacked, beaten, her jaw shattered, her beauty destroyed, justice failed him. The two young men responsible, the sons of wealthy, well-connected families, had walked free with suspended sentences. They had smirked in the courtroom, knowing they would never be punished for what they had done. Bonasera, humiliated and furious, left the courthouse with only one thought in his mind: I must see Don Corleone. The summer of 1945 brought celebration to America. The war was over, soldiers were returning home, and prosperity loomed on the horizon. But in Long Beach, at the sprawling estate of Don Vito Corleone, the reason for celebration was more personal. His only daughter, Constanzia Connie Corleone, was getting married to Carlo Rizzi, a young man from Nevada who had managed to charm his way into the family. The Corleone home, a fortress-like property with its own high walls and iron gates, was open to hundreds of guests, a blend of relatives, close associates, and those who wished to pay their respects to the Don. The wedding was a grand affair. Musicians played, long tables were covered in Sicilian dishes, and guests moved through the garden in the heat of the afternoon, drinking homemade wine and indulging in laughter. The Corleones ensured the event was lavish, but the real business of the day was not the wedding itself. It was the steady stream of men waiting for a private audience with Don Corleone. Bonasera was among them. When his turn arrived, he entered the cool, dimly lit office where the Don sat behind a heavy walnut desk. The room smelled of cigars, whiskey, and polished wood. Don Corleone, an aging yet imposing man, listened patiently as Bonasera, a man who had always kept his distance from the Mafia, now pleaded for his help. Bonasera wanted the two young men punished severely. He even offered money, a desperate attempt to buy justice. But Don Corleone was not a man who dealt in mere transactions. He valued loyalty, respect, friendship. He leaned forward, his deep-set eyes locked onto Bonasera's. "You found America a paradise," he said, his voice calm but edged with quiet disappointment. "You never needed a friend like me. But now you come to me and you ask for murder." Bonasera, realizing his mistake, quickly corrected himself. "Not murder," he whispered, his throat dry. "Just justice." Satisfied, Don Corleone nodded and gestured to his men. "They will suffer," he promised, "as she has suffered." With that, Bonasera bowed his head. He kissed the Don's hand, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken debt he now owed. Outside, the wedding continued in full swing. The bride, Connie, was radiant in her white dress, though there was tension beneath her smiles. Her new husband, Carlo Rizzi, was handsome but carried an air of arrogance, as though he already saw himself as something greater than he was. He was not Sicilian, not truly part of their world, and though Don Corleone had accepted him into the family, he had done so with a father's cautious skepticism. At the heart of the festivities stood the Corleone brothers. The eldest, Santino Sonny Corleone, was the heir apparent, tall, broad-shouldered, and brimming with barely contained energy. His temper was infamous, his womanizing even more so. Even on this sacred family occasion, he could not help himself. He was already sneaking away with one of the bridesmaids, slipping into the house for a moment of passion while his wife, Sandra, pretended not to notice. Vito Corleone, the middle son, was different. He was a quiet observer, content with the pleasures of food and drink, lacking the strength and confidence of his older brother. He was not a fool, but he was weak, too weak to hold the weight of the family on his shoulders. Then there was Michael Corleone, the youngest. He was different from his brothers in every way. A war hero, a college man, dressed in a conservative brown suit rather than the flashy attire of the Sicilian men around him. He did not walk with the same air of untouchable power as Sonny or the quiet entitlement of Vito. He was his father's favorite, but he had chosen a path outside the family business. He had even brought an outsider, his American girlfriend, Kay Adams. Kay was fascinated by the wedding, by the sheer size of the celebration, the old-world traditions of the Sicilian people. She watched as men approached Don Corleone, kissing his hand, speaking to him in low, reverent tones. She could feel the power radiating from him, even as he sat quietly, offering only a nod or a few measured words. Michael saw her curiosity, and with a slight smile, decided to share a story. He told her about his father's old friend, Johnny Fontaine, the famous singer, who had once been trapped in an ironclad contract with a ruthless bandleader. Johnny had come to the Don for help, and the Don had offered the bandleader a deal. A small favor, Michael said, watching Kay's expression. A friendly negotiation. But the man had refused, and so Don Corleone had sent his enforcer, Luca Brasi. The next time the bandleader was asked to release Johnny from the contract, he was given a choice: sign the papers or have his brains splattered across them. He had signed immediately. Kay stared at Michael, horrified yet intrigued. "That's my family, Kay," Michael said softly. "Not me." But even as he said it, there was an unmistakable undertone in his voice. He was separate, yes, but he was still a Corleone. As the wedding reached its peak, another guest arrived, Johnny Fontaine himself. The singer, beloved by the crowd, was greeted with cheers and adoration. But behind his charming smile, he was troubled. His career was waning, his voice failing. There was one chance to save himself, a role in an upcoming Hollywood film. But the studio head, Jack Woltz, despised him and refused to give him the part. Johnny knew only one man could help him. He disappeared into Don Corleone's study, where he dropped to his knees, tears in his eyes. "Godfather," he murmured, his voice breaking. "Help me." Don Corleone took a slow breath, watching the young man he had once lifted from obscurity. He had given Johnny everything: his first breaks, his rise to fame. And now, here he was, groveling. "You can act like a man," the Don said sharply, slapping Johnny lightly on the face. Still, he did not refuse him. He turned to Tom Hagen, his consigliere, and gave a quiet command. Tom would go to Hollywood to speak to Jack Woltz personally. The Corleones did not make requests. They made offers. As the sun set over the Corleone estate, as music filled the air and the guests danced beneath the lanterns, the first moves in a game of power were already being played. In the coming days, deals would be made, alliances forged, and old rivalries reignited. And soon, blood would be spilled. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the Corleone estate, the wedding festivities slowly began to wind down. Inside the house, however, business was still being conducted. Tom Hagen, the family's consigliere, sat across from Don Corleone, listening attentively as the Don gave his instructions regarding Johnny Fontaine's predicament. Hagen, ever the calm and efficient lawyer, understood exactly what was expected of him. He would leave for Hollywood the next morning, carrying the weight of the Corleone name with him. Meanwhile, outside, Michael Corleone and Kay Adams remained at their table, watching the guests filter out. The wedding had been an overwhelming experience for Kay, an immersion into a world she had only vaguely understood before. The open displays of respect, the whispered conversations, the way men instinctively bowed their heads as they passed Don Corleone. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. Yet, despite Michael's casual manner, she couldn't ignore the way he carried himself, the way others regarded him, even if he claimed to be separate from the family business. Back inside, Don Corleone finally stepped away from the private affairs of his guests and joined his family. Connie, flushed from dancing, was sitting beside Carlo Rizzi, still caught up in the excitement of her special day. The Don, ever the loving father, placed a hand on her cheek, offering a rare, gentle smile. Yet when his eyes met Carlo's, there was something else, a quiet, assessing stare, as if measuring the worth of the man who had just married his daughter. Santino, still reeking of wine and his brief tryst with the bridesmaid, entered the room next, his face flushed with excitement. His loud, boisterous energy filled the space, and the Don regarded him with a mixture of amusement and caution. Sonny was powerful, capable, and fearless, but he was also reckless. He acted on impulse, driven by emotion rather than strategy, and Don Corleone knew that such a trait could be dangerous in their world. Frito, as usual, lingered in the background, laughing a little too much, drinking a little too freely. He had no place in the business, and everyone knew it. Then there was Michael. When he entered the room with Kay, there was an unspoken shift in the air. Don Corleone's expression softened, but there was also something else, an understanding that Michael had placed himself outside of the family's affairs. He had chosen a different path. Kay was introduced properly to the Don, and despite her initial apprehension, she found herself charmed by his warmth. He was not the cold, terrifying figure she had imagined. He was polite, kind even, and his old-world mannerisms made her feel unexpectedly welcome. Yet beneath that exterior, Kay knew there was something deeper, something she couldn't yet fully grasp. As the last of the guests departed, the family finally gathered in private. Tom Hagen approached the Don, suitcase in hand, ready to leave for Hollywood. Don Corleone gave him final instructions: be respectful, but firm. Jack Woltz would listen, whether he wanted to or not. The next morning, Tom Hagen arrived in Los Angeles, where he was met by a car sent by Woltz's studio. The drive to the mogul's lavish estate was long, winding through the sun-soaked hills of Hollywood, past sprawling mansions and iron gates. When he finally arrived, Woltz greeted him with an air of forced politeness. He knew exactly who Hagen represented. The two men sat down for dinner in Woltz's grand dining hall, where the studio head wasted no time making his stance clear. Johnny Fontaine would never get the part he wanted, not as long as Woltz was in charge. Hagen remained calm, his lawyer's demeanor never breaking. He listened as Woltz ranted about how much he despised Fontaine, how the singer had seduced a young actress under contract with his studio and humiliated him. When Woltz finished, Hagen leaned forward slightly, his voice measured and polite. Mr. Corleone is a man who insists on hearing bad news immediately, he said. He explained, in careful terms, that Don Corleone greatly valued Johnny Fontaine and simply wanted the role to be granted. Woltz sneered, mistaking Hagen's quiet approach for weakness. He dismissed the offer outright, making it clear that he was not afraid of the Corleone family. But Hagen remained composed. He thanked Woltz for his hospitality, excused himself, and left. That night, Walt slept soundly in his extravagant bedroom, unaware that something had changed. In the stillness of the early morning, the servants heard a piercing scream that shattered the calm. Walt awoke to find his silk sheets drenched in warm, sticky blood. The metallic scent filled the room. Panicked, he threw back the covers, and there, at the foot of his bed, lay the severed head of his prized thoroughbred horse. Its lifeless eyes stared up at him, its mouth frozen open in a grotesque, silent scream. The message was clear. By noon, Johnny Fontaine had the role. Back in New York, the Corleones continued their daily affairs. Business was booming, and the Don's influence remained unshaken. But in the shadows, trouble was brewing. Virgil, the Turk Sollozzo, a rising figure in the criminal underworld, had been making moves. He was backed by the Tattaglia family, one of the Corleones' rivals, and had gained a reputation as a man who could bring in massive profits. His business was heroin, and he was looking for protection. One evening, Sollozzo arranged a meeting with Don Corleone at Genco Pura Olive Oil, the front for the family's operations. He laid out his proposal. With the Corleones' political connections and muscle, he could expand the drug trade without interference from the police. The profits would be enormous. But Don Corleone was not interested. Drugs, he believed, were dangerous business. Unlike gambling or liquor, narcotics invited too much scrutiny. Judges, politicians, men who had long been on the Corleone payroll would not tolerate it. He listened to Sollozzo's pitch, his expression unreadable, before calmly declining the offer. Sollozzo did not argue, but there was a glint in his eye that did not sit well with the Don. He turned his attention to Sonny, who had been sitting beside his father during the meeting. Sonny, always impulsive, showed too much interest. He asked a few too many questions, revealed a little too much curiosity about the potential profits. The Don noticed. When the meeting ended and Sollozzo left, Don Corleone turned to his eldest son with quiet fury. "Never tell anyone outside the family what you're thinking again," he warned. But the damage had already been done. Sollozzo had seen the crack in the armor. He knew that if he could not deal with Don Corleone, perhaps Sonny would be more receptive. The following days were tense. The Don's instincts told him that trouble was coming, and his instincts had never failed him before. He had refused Sollozzo's deal, and that meant one thing: he had made an enemy. On a chilly afternoon, Don Corleone left the Genco Olive Oil office, stepping onto the busy New York street. He moved slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his thoughts deep in contemplation. The city bustled around him, unaware that the world was about to change. Then, from the shadows, they emerged. Two men, guns drawn. The Don barely had time to react before the deafening blasts echoed through the street. The force of the bullets sent him sprawling to the pavement. The world around him faded, and for the first time in his life, Don Corleone lay helpless. The gunshots rang out like a violent punctuation to the busy New York street. In the chaos that followed, pedestrians screamed and scattered, some ducking behind parked cars, others rushing into nearby shops for cover. The assassins, their task completed, fled before anyone could react. Don Corleone lay sprawled on the pavement, blood pooling beneath him, his body still. Fred Corleone, who had been just steps behind his father, fumbled for his gun with trembling hands. Panic overtook him, and as he struggled to draw his weapon, the gun slipped from his grasp, clattering uselessly onto the sidewalk. He could only watch helplessly as bystanders cautiously approached the fallen Don, whispering in hushed, horrified tones. The news spread rapidly. Within minutes, the Corleone compound was alive with activity. Sonny Corleone, lounging at home with his mistress, was the first to get the call. His expression changed instantly, a flash of raw fury overtaking him. He barked orders into the phone before slamming it down, his mind already racing with the implications. His father had been shot. That meant war. At the hospital, the atmosphere was tense. Tom Hagen arrived first, moving through the sterile corridors with the careful precision of a man accustomed to handling crises. He demanded to know the Don's condition and was relieved to learn that, miraculously, the old man was still alive. The bullets had torn through his body, but he had survived, for now. Sonny arrived next, his movements brisk and purposeful, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might crack. He wasted no time assessing the situation, immediately recognizing the vulnerability of their position. If Salazzo and the Tattaglias had made their move, they would not stop now. His father was defenseless, and the hospital had no guards. Michael had been away when the shooting occurred, spending time with Kay and trying, as always, to keep a foot outside the world of his family. When he heard the news, everything else faded. Without hesitation, he rushed to the hospital. The sight of his father, pale and motionless in the hospital bed, was a shock. This was not the indomitable Don Corleone he had known all his life. This was an old man clinging to life, hooked up to tubes and machines, his powerful presence reduced to frailty. Michael's mind worked quickly. Something was wrong. The halls were eerily empty. There were no Corleone guards, no police presence. He stepped out and found the nurse, a nervous young woman who looked at him with frightened eyes. "They've been told to leave," she whispered. "By the police." It was in that moment that Michael understood. Salazzo wasn't finished. He had failed to kill the Don outright, but now he would make sure the job was done. And with no protection, his father was as good as dead. Michael acted without hesitation. He moved to his father's bed and gently placed a hand on his cheek. "Pop, I'm with you," he whispered. Then, turning to the nurse, he issued a quiet but firm order. "We have to move him." The nurse hesitated but saw the determination in Michael's eyes. Together, they wheeled Don Corleone out of his vulnerable position, shifting him further down the corridor, away from immediate sight. The tension thickened. Michael could feel it in the air, the sense of something looming. Then he heard footsteps. From outside the hospital, the distinct sound of approaching shoes echoed through the empty hallway. Shadows moved past the frosted glass of the front doors. Michael's pulse quickened. The assassins were here. Thinking fast, he turned to the terrified nurse. "Hold your nerve," he said. He then stepped out into the entrance hall and positioned himself in front of the hospital doors, his hands tucked into his pockets. The men outside hesitated. From their vantage point, it looked like Michael was armed. He stood firm, his expression impassive, staring them down. They exchanged glances, uncertain. The tension hung thick in the air for an agonizing moment. Then, slowly, they retreated. Michael let out a quiet breath, but didn't allow himself to relax. He knew this wasn't over. Just then, a familiar voice called out, "Mike, what the hell are you doing here alone?" Michael turned to see Enzo the baker, a small-time associate of the Corleone family. Enzo had simply come to pay his respects, but in that moment, Michael saw an opportunity. "Stand here with me," he instructed. Though Enzo was visibly shaking, he obeyed. Michael guided him into position, showed him how to pretend he had a gun in his coat. Together, they stood at the entrance like two silent sentinels. Minutes passed. A police car pulled up, but instead of providing protection, the officer who stepped out only made things worse. Captain McCluskey, a corrupt cop in Salazzo's pocket, approached Michael with a sneer. "What are you doing here, kid?" Michael, despite his fear, remained calm. "Looking after my father." McCluskey's expression darkened. He had been paid well to clear the hospital of protection, and now this unexpected interference irritated him. Without warning, he lashed out. The punch landed hard against Michael's face, sending him reeling. A sharp pain shot through his jaw, and he stumbled, tasting blood. McCluskey didn't care. He smirked, straightened his uniform, and signaled his men to move in. The intimidation was clear: stay out of this or suffer the consequences. But Michael had already made his choice. By the time Sonny arrived at the hospital with reinforcements, the immediate danger had passed, but Michael was seething. He had never been a part of the business, had never wanted to be. But something inside him had changed. The sight of his father, so vulnerable, the realization of the danger, the sting of McCluskey's blow, it had ignited something. Later that night, back at the Corleone compound, Michael sat with Sonny, Tom Hagen, and the other men. The room was thick with cigar smoke, the air tense with talk of retaliation. Salazzo had made his move. The Corleones needed to strike back. Michael listened as they debated their next steps. Sonny, all fire and fury, wanted an immediate hit. Tom, always the strategist, advised caution. The other capos weighed in with their own suggestions, but no consensus was reached. Then Michael spoke. His voice was calm, measured. "I'll do it," he said. The room went silent. Sonny laughed, thinking his younger brother was joking. But Michael wasn't. He looked at Hagen, then at Sonny. "I'll kill Salazzo," he repeated. The words hung in the air. Sonny's smile faded. Tom leaned forward, studying Michael carefully. Michael laid it out, step by step. He would meet Salazzo and McCluskey under the guise of truce talks. They would be relaxed, off guard. He would retrieve a hidden gun from the restroom, and then 2 shots. One for Salazzo, one for McCluskey. The transformation had begun. The war was no longer just between the families. It was inside Michael himself. The man who once wanted nothing to do with this world was stepping into its darkest depths. And there would be no turning back. The decision had been made. Michael would be the one to kill Salazzo and McCluskey. It was an unthinkable choice only days before, but now it was inevitable. The strike against his father had forced Michael to cross a line he had long avoided. The others in the room still struggled to fully grasp what they were seeing. Michael was the college boy, the war hero, the Corleone who had a future outside the family. But as he sat there, outlining the plan in a steady, unshaken voice, it was clear that something fundamental had changed. Sonny, always quick to react with emotion, still found it hard to believe. "You," he scoffed, half laughing but watching Michael closely. "You want to kill them both," Michael nodded. He wasn't smiling. Tom Hagen, the ever-cautious consigliere, leaned forward, his lawyer's mind weighing the risks. "It's not just about pulling the trigger, Mike. McCluskey is a cop. That makes it dangerous, makes it messy." Michael's response was measured. "McCluskey is a crooked cop protecting a known criminal. It won't look like murder. It'll look like business." His logic was chilling. Sonny, still processing, glanced at the others. Clemenza and Tessio were silent, waiting. The transformation in Michael was undeniable, but they still had to plan it right. It was Clemenza who spoke next, his heavy voice breaking the tension. "All right, kid," he said. "If you're serious, we gotta do this right." He turned to Sonny. "We set up a meeting, neutral territory, restaurant, quiet place." Sonny, finally convinced, nodded. "Yeah, Salazzo will want to talk. He'll want to smooth things over, make us think we can negotiate." Michael understood the importance of making Salazzo feel safe. would be the only way to get close enough. He also knew he'd have to act fast. "Where's the gun?" he asked. Clemenza smirked. He had already been thinking ahead. "Don't worry, we'll plant it. I'll take care of it." The next few days were a blur of careful planning. Michael had never killed before, but he listened, learned. Clemenza took him aside, instructing him on the weapon he would use, a small pistol with the serial numbers filed off. It would be hidden in the bathroom of the restaurant where the meeting would take place. "You go in," Clemenza explained. "Excuse yourself, find the gun. Come out, 2 shots to the head. No hesitation." Michael absorbed every word. He was calm, eerily so. Even when Clemenza warned him about the aftershock, about the way killing a man could shake a person to the core, Michael remained composed. Sonny was less restrained. As the time for the meeting neared, he grew anxious, pacing, snapping at anyone who questioned the plan. It wasn't just the risk, it was the deeper fear that they were losing Michael, that his little brother was stepping into something he could never escape. Finally, the moment arrived. The meeting was set. Salazzo, believing he still had the upper hand, agreed to sit down with Michael. McCluskey would be there too, his role as protector now a thin pretense. They chose a small, out-of-the-way restaurant in the Bronx. Michael dressed carefully that night. He looked at himself in the mirror, seeing someone different than the man he had been only weeks ago. Kay, unaware of the details but sensing the shift in him, asked if he was all right. He only nodded, kissed her lightly, and left. The drive to the meeting was quiet. In the back seat of the car, Michael sat with his hands resting on his lap, his face unreadable. The men around him, Tessio's soldiers, were tense but didn't speak. They knew what was coming. When Michael arrived at the restaurant, Salazzo greeted him with a friendly nod. "Glad you came," he said smoothly, as if this were just another business meeting. McCluskey, chewing on a thick piece of veal, barely acknowledged him, more interested in his food. They took their seats. The waiter approached, and wine was ordered. Salazzo wasted no time. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "I'm going to be honest with you, Michael. This war is bad for business. Nobody wants it, and nobody needs it." Michael listened. His face remained impassive. Salazzo continued, speaking carefully, watching for any reaction. "Your father's going to pull through. That's good. Means we can still work this out without too much bloodshed." Michael nodded slightly, but said nothing. He was waiting for the signal, for Tessio's man outside to let him know that everything was in place. The plan was simple. Wait for the right moment, excuse himself to the restroom, retrieve the gun, and come back shooting. McCluskey interrupted the talk to take another bite of his meal, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Kid, relax," he said, chuckling. "I know you're nervous, you should be, but you play ball, and this'll all blow over." Michael forced himself to keep his breathing steady. Then, finally, the signal came. "I need to use the bathroom," he said, his voice controlled. McCluskey narrowed his eyes. "Hold it." Michael met his gaze, unfazed. "You gonna frisk me again?" he asked. The challenge was subtle, but it worked. McCluskey rolled his eyes and waved him off. Michael stood, walked calmly toward the back of the restaurant. Every step felt deliberate, like walking through water. Inside the bathroom, the air was thick and stale. He turned to the toilet, just as Clemenza had said, and reached behind the old-fashioned tank. His fingers touched cold steel. The gun was there. He took it, inhaled sharply. His hands were steady. This was it. Michael stepped back into the dining room. Salazzo was mid-sentence. His words cut off the instant Michael raised the gun. 2 shots. The first struck Salazzo squarely in the head, his body slumping before he even realized what had happened. The second was for McCluskey, straight to the throat. The corrupt cop barely had time to reach for his gun before Michael fired again, finishing him with a final shot to the head. The restaurant erupted in chaos. Plates crashed to the floor. A woman screamed. Michael didn't move. He had been told to drop the gun immediately, but instead he hesitated, staring at the bodies. Then, with an almost mechanical motion, he let the gun slip from his hand. He turned and walked out, pushing past the stunned onlookers. Outside, a waiting car was already moving toward him. He climbed in. The door shut. The engine roared. They drove into the night, leaving behind the bodies, the blood, and the Michael Corleone that once was. The transformation was complete, and now he had to disappear. The car sped through the darkened streets, carrying Michael away from the restaurant, away from the chaos, and away from the world he had known. No one spoke as the city blurred past. The men beside him, Tessio's soldiers, drove with quiet urgency, their expressions unreadable. They had done this before. But for Michael, everything had changed. He sat still, staring ahead, his mind racing but his body unnervingly calm. He had just killed 2 men. Salazzo and McCluskey were dead, their blood pooling on the floor of that quiet restaurant. And now, there was no turning back. Sonny and Tom were waiting when he arrived at the safe house. The moment Michael stepped through the door, Sonny grabbed him by the shoulders, his expression a mixture of pride, relief, and something else, perhaps a flicker of sorrow. "Nice work, kid," Sonny said, clapping him on the back. "You did good." Tom, ever the strategist, was already thinking ahead. "We don't have much time. Every cop in the city is going to be looking for you, Mike. We need to get you out of the country." Michael nodded. He had known this was coming. The moment he pulled the trigger, he had accepted what would follow. He couldn't stay in New York. The police would tear the city apart looking for Don Corleone's son, and even the family's political connections wouldn't be enough to keep him safe. There was only one option: Sicily. Arrangements were made quickly. The Corleones still had powerful friends in Italy, and with a little help from their allies, Michael could disappear into the countryside, far from the reach of the American authorities. Clemenza and Tessio had already planned the route. Michael would be smuggled out, moved through connections that owed the family favors. By the time the police pieced together what had happened, he would be long gone. Before he left, Michael had one last night in New York. He returned to the house in Long Beach under the cover of darkness, avoiding the eyes of neighbors, knowing this might be the last time he saw it for years. He had expected Kay to be there, waiting for him, but Tom had intervened. "It's better this way," Tom had said. "She'll only ask questions and you don't have answers." Michael knew Tom was right, but it didn't make it any easier. Kay had always been his tie to a different world, the one he thought he could have. Now that world was slipping away. He had chosen another path. By morning, Michael was on his way to Sicily. The journey was long, the kind of trip that forced a man to sit with his thoughts. Michael barely spoke. He had been told to keep his head down, to avoid drawing attention, and he followed orders without question. But as the days passed, he felt himself changing. The shock of what he had done had worn off, replaced by something deeper: acceptance. He had killed, but he had done it for his father, for the family. He didn't regret it. Sicily was like another world. When Michael arrived, he was met by men loyal to the Corleones, old friends of Don Vito who had been waiting for him. They took him deep into the countryside, to a small village far from the reach of the law. It was a place untouched by modern life, where time moved slowly, and the family's influence ran deep. Here, Michael Corleone ceased to exist. He became simply the American, a quiet stranger living under the protection of Don Tomasino, an old friend of his father's who ruled the region with the same quiet authority that Don Vito commanded in New York. Tomasino welcomed Michael like a son, offering him sanctuary, a place to heal, to wait. "You are safe here," he assured him. "No one will find you." Michael settled into his new life, but he remained cautious. He never went anywhere without armed guards, and he spoke little of his past. The men who protected him knew better than to ask questions. They saw him for what he was, a man in exile, a man who had crossed a line and could never go back. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. Michael walked the hills, taking in the rugged beauty of the land, but he never let his guard down. He had enemies now, men who would never forgive what he had done. The Corleone name still carried weight in Sicily, but it was no guarantee of safety. He could not afford to be careless. And then, one day, everything changed. It happened in the village square. Michael had been walking with his bodyguards, keeping to himself as always, when he saw her. A young woman, dark-haired, with eyes like burning embers. She was beautiful in a way that stopped him cold. She walked with grace, unaware of the effect she had, and in that moment, Michael felt something stir in him that he hadn't expected. He asked the old men at the cafe about her, and they chuckled knowingly. "That is Apollonia," one of them said, "the daughter of Signor Vitelli." Michael nodded, but his mind was already racing. He had been in Sicily long enough to know that things were done differently here. A man didn't simply approach a woman. He had to go through the family, through her father. It was a process, a ritual, and it had to be done with respect. The next day, accompanied by his bodyguards, Michael visited the home of Signor Vitelli. The old man greeted him warily, knowing full well that this American was no ordinary man. Michael spoke carefully, with the humility expected of a suitor. He made his intentions clear. He wished to court Apollonia, if her father would allow it. Vitelli was cautious. He knew the Corleone name, but he did not give his blessing easily. He watched Michael closely, weighing his words, considering the kind of man he was. But in the end, tradition won out. He agreed, and the courtship began. Michael had never courted a woman like this before. In America, things were different. But here in Sicily, he followed the old ways. He met with Apollonia under the watchful eyes of her family, speaking in quiet tones, never touching her, never rushing. She was shy at first, but as the days passed, she grew bolder, her eyes betraying a growing affection. For the first time since he had arrived in Sicily, Michael felt something close to peace. He knew he was still a hunted man, but with Apollonia, he could forget, if only for a little while. The wedding came soon after. It was a grand affair, a traditional Sicilian ceremony with music, feasting, and the blessing of the entire village. Michael stood beside Apollonia, watching as she smiled at him with a mixture of love and innocence. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could build a life here. But Michael had forgotten the most important lesson his father had ever taught him. No man is truly safe. Not in America, not in Sicily. And his enemies had not forgotten him. Michael had almost convinced himself that he could start over, that he could leave behind the violence and bloodshed that had forced him into exile. In the weeks after his wedding to Apollonia, he embraced the quiet simplicity of Sicilian life. His days were spent walking through the sun-drenched fields, visiting the villagers who now regarded him as one of their own, and learning the old customs he had once ignored as an American-born son of an immigrant. His nights were filled with laughter, wine, and the warmth of his new wife's embrace. But in the back of his mind, he knew this peace was an illusion. The The shadow of his past loomed over him, growing darker with each passing day. The Corleone name carried weight in Sicily, but it also invited danger. There were men who would never forget the murder of Salazzo and McCluskey, men who would cross an ocean to see him dead. And Michael, for all his newfound happiness, had not forgotten what it meant to be a Corleone. He still carried a gun wherever he went. He still had bodyguards at his side. And he still woke in the middle of the night, his instincts sharpened by the fear that one day someone would come for him. Don Tomasino had warned him as much. Though the old Sicilian Don had provided Michael with refuge, he was no fool. He knew that Michael's exile could not last forever. "There are whispers," he told Michael one evening as they sat in his estate, drinking strong Sicilian wine. "Your enemies have long memories. You should not grow too comfortable here." Michael nodded, but he said nothing. He already knew. He had always known. Still, he had allowed himself to hope. And it was that hope that made what happened next all the more devastating. It started with a mistake. A small one, but in Michael's world, even the smallest mistake could be fatal. One afternoon, one of Michael's bodyguards, a young man named Fabrizio, had begun asking too many questions. He had been loyal at first, eager to serve, but lately, Michael had noticed a change in him. There was something different in his eyes, a nervous energy that hadn't been there before. Then came the questions, subtle at first, but growing bolder. "Do you ever think about returning to America?" he had asked once, too casually. "Do you think your family will send for you soon?" Michael had dismissed it at the time. But now, in hindsight, he knew he should have been more cautious. He should have listened to his instincts. One evening, as he prepared to leave the villa with Apollonia, Michael had a strange feeling. He couldn't explain it, just an unease, a slight change in the air, something that made his pulse quicken. He hesitated, glancing around, scanning the quiet courtyard. Everything seemed normal, too normal. Then Apollonia smiled at him, laughing as she ran ahead toward the small car they had parked outside the villa. "I will drive today," she called, teasing him in her broken English. Michael smiled back, but the feeling of unease did not leave him. His hand hovered near his gun as he followed her. Then, just as Apollonia reached the car, everything exploded. A deafening blast ripped through the courtyard, sending fire and debris flying in all directions. Michael was thrown backward, his ears ringing, his vision blurred by the cloud of smoke and dust that filled the air. He coughed, trying to breathe, trying to move, but his body refused to obey. When the smoke cleared, the sight that met his eyes shattered whatever illusions he had left. The car was gone, nothing remained but twisted metal and fire. Apollonia, his wife, his love, the woman who had made him believe in a future beyond violence, was gone. Michael's mind refused to accept it. He staggered forward, reaching for her, but there was nothing left to reach for, only flames, only ruin. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something, a figure moving in the distance, slipping away through the trees. Fabrizio. The betrayal was like a knife in his chest. The young man had been like a brother, a trusted guard, always at his side. But he had sold him out. And now Apollonia was dead because of it. Rage overtook grief. Michael's body moved before his mind could catch up. He grabbed his gun, ignoring the pain in his limbs, and ran. But by the time he reached the grove where Fabrizio had been, the traitor was gone. He had vanished into the Sicilian hills, leaving only a trail of dust in his wake. Michael stood there for a long time, his gun heavy in his hand, his breath ragged. He had failed. He had let his guard down, and now the one person who had made this exile bearable was gone. The funeral was a quiet affair. The The village mourned with him, but their words meant nothing. He stood at the grave, staring at the freshly turned earth, feeling nothing. No tears came, no sobs, only silence. Don Tomasino stood beside him. "This was meant for you," the old man said softly. Michael nodded. He knew that. The car bomb had been meant for him, not Apollonia. But it didn't matter. She was gone. And with her, any last piece of the man he had once been. That night, as he sat alone in the villa, staring at the empty space where she used to sleep, Michael made his decision. His exile was over. It was time to go home. News had reached Sicily that the war in New York was changing. The Corleones had been fighting a long and bloody battle with the other families, but things were shifting. Don Vito Corleone had recovered from his wounds. He was alive, and more than that, he was ready to make peace. Michael knew what that meant. His father, the great Don, was preparing for the next move, and Michael had a role to play in it. When he met with Don Tomasino the next morning, he spoke with a voice that was colder, harder than before. "Get me in touch with my father," he said. "Tell him I'm ready." Tomasino nodded. He had known this day would come. "You will be careful, my boy," he said. Michael looked at him, and for the first time, there was no warmth in his eyes. "I will be better than careful," he said. "I will be ready." And with that, Michael Corleone, the man who had once wanted nothing to do with the family, prepared to return to the world he had left behind. The son of Don Vito was coming home, and when he did, there would be a reckoning. Michael Corleone returned to America a changed man. The young war hero who had once scoffed at the ways of the Mafia was gone. In his place stood a hardened, calculating figure shaped by exile, grief, and betrayal. His time in Sicily had stripped away the last remnants of his innocence. He had learned lessons there that no one could teach him in New York, lessons about loyalty, deception, and the price of letting one's guard down. Now, as he stepped back onto American soil, he was no longer a bystander to his family's affairs. He was a Corleone in every sense of the word. His arrival was quiet, arranged with the utmost secrecy. Only a handful of trusted men knew he was back. His father's enemies still lurked in the shadows, and Michael had no intention of making himself an easy target. He was escorted to the Corleone compound in Long Beach, where the family had been waging a careful but bitter war against their rivals. The first person he saw was Tom Hagen. The consigliere greeted him with a mixture of relief and concern. "Michael, it's good to have you home," he said. "Your father's been waiting for you." Michael could see the exhaustion in Tom's face. The war had worn on him. It had worn on them all. Sonny had fought hard to keep the family strong after the Don was shot, but his brutal methods had only escalated tensions. Now, Sonny was gone, gunned down in a bloody ambush that had nearly shattered the Corleone family. Tom led Michael through the house, filling him in on everything that had transpired during his absence. The loss of Sonny had changed everything. The Corleones could not afford to keep fighting an endless war. It was time to make peace. Michael stepped into his father's study and found Don Vito Corleone seated behind his desk. The old man looked thinner, weaker than before. The assassination attempt had drained him, but his presence still carried immense authority. His dark eyes studied Michael carefully, taking in the differences, the hardened demeanor, the quiet, measured way he moved. "Michael," the Don said, his voice low but firm, "you've come home." Michael nodded. He walked forward and kissed his father's hand, a gesture of respect and recognition of the Don's power. "I'm ready, Pop," he said. "Whatever you need me to do." For a long moment, Don Vito said nothing. Then, with With a slight nod, he gestured for Michael to sit. The two men spoke in private for hours. The Don explained his plan. The war had cost them too much Sunny men resources, and most of all, time. They could not afford to keep fighting. Don Vito had brokered a peace agreement with the other families, a truce that would end the bloodshed and allow the Corleones to recover their strength. But the Don had no illusions. This peace would not last forever. Their enemies had made their move once. They would do so again. And when that time came, the Corleones had to be ready. Michael understood. He listened carefully, absorbing every word, every nuance of his father's strategy. The old Don had always thought ahead, playing the long game while others acted on impulse. That was why he had survived when so many others had fallen. Now, it was Michael's turn to carry that burden. A few days later, the peace meeting took place. All the major New York families gathered under one roof, with Don Vito Corleone at the head of the table. The room was filled with powerful men: Don Barzini, Don Tattaglia, Don Stracci, and Don Cuneo, all of them dressed in fine suits, all of them wearing expressions of practiced diplomacy. They had fought this war with bullets and blood, but now they would fight with words. Don Corleone spoke first, his voice calm but commanding. He acknowledged the losses on both sides and expressed his desire to end the conflict. "I forego all vengeance for my son," he declared, his tone betraying no emotion. "But I have selfish reasons. My youngest son has just returned from a faraway country, and I wish to see him safe." It was a message as much as it was a plea. He was making it clear that if the other families honored the peace, so would he. Don Barzini, the most powerful of the rival bosses, nodded in agreement. "We all respect you, Don Corleone," he said smoothly. "We should not let this war continue. Too much blood has been spilled already." The agreement was reached. The Corleones would withdraw from certain interests, particularly narcotics, which had been the source of the war in the first place. In return, the other families would allow peace to hold. The meeting ended with handshakes, forced smiles, and carefully chosen words of goodwill. But Michael, standing quietly by his father's side, watched their faces. He saw the deception hidden behind their eyes. Later, in private, Michael spoke to his father. "It was Barzini all along," he said simply. The Don nodded. He had come to the same conclusion. Barzini had been the true mastermind behind the attacks on the Corleones, using Tattaglia as a front. "You are right," the Don admitted. "But now is not the time." Michael understood. The Corleones would abide by the peace, for now. But the moment would come when they would strike back, and when that time arrived, it would be decisive. In the days that followed, the Corleone family began restructuring. The truce had given them breathing room, and Don Vito used it wisely. He started preparing for a future where he would no longer lead, guiding Michael through the intricacies of the family business. Michael, in turn, absorbed everything. He met with Caporgimes, learned about the Corleone interests, and studied the weaknesses of their enemies. One evening, Don Vito took Michael aside for a private conversation. They sat in the garden, the old Don looking out over the estate he had built with a quiet, weary pride. "There wasn't enough time, Michael," he said. "I never wanted this life for you. But now that you are in it, you must be strong." Michael said nothing. He had already accepted his fate. The Don sighed. "Barzini will move against you first. He will arrange a meeting. He will use someone close to you to set the trap." Michael listened carefully. This was more than advice, it was a warning. "I won't make the same mistakes, Pop," he said. Don Vito studied him for a long time. Then, with a small nod, he smiled. as if he finally understood something. "You're the one who will make them pay," he said softly. Days later, the Don suffered a fatal heart attack while playing with his grandson in the garden. The great Don Corleone, the man who had built an empire through power and cunning, died not in violence, but in the embrace of his family. But for Michael, there was no time for mourning. His father's death had set the final pieces in motion. The truce would not last. The enemies of the Corleones were waiting, and soon Michael would show them that he was ready, because now, at last, he was the Don. The death of Don Vito Corleone was the end of an era, but Michael Corleone did not mourn the way others did. While the rest of the family grieved the loss of the old Don, Michael remained composed, detached even. He had already accepted what his father's passing meant. He was now the head of the Corleone family, and he was ready. The other families underestimated him. They had assumed he was nothing more than a temporary figure, a placeholder, until someone more seasoned emerged. But Michael had been preparing for this moment ever since he first pulled the trigger on Salazzo and McCluskey. His time in exile had hardened him, and his return to America had been anything but passive. He had spent years studying his enemies, learning their weaknesses, and now that his father was gone, it was time for him to act. While the other families extended their condolences, Michael knew their sympathies were hollow. Don Emilio Barzini had been the real orchestrator of the attacks against the Corleones, manipulating the Tartaglias and others to weaken the family. Now, Barzini was waiting for the right moment to strike the final blow, to eliminate the Corleones entirely. But Michael had no intention of waiting for that to happen. The first step was to consolidate power within his own ranks. He called a meeting with his capos, Clemenza and Rocco Lampone, and a few of the family's most trusted men. He told them exactly what was going to happen. The Corleones would no longer be on the defensive. They would strike back, but not in a way their enemies expected. Michael's strategy was one of patience. He would lull them into a false sense of security, let them believe he was weak, before eliminating them all in one decisive stroke. At the same time, Michael focused on securing the family's future beyond New York. His father had started the transition into Las Vegas, but it was Michael who would see it through. The Corleones needed a legitimate business to serve as their stronghold, and the casinos were the perfect choice. But there was one obstacle standing in the way: Mo Green. Green was an old-school gambler, a ruthless businessman who had built his empire in Vegas with sheer force of will. He had partnered with the Corleones in the early days, but he had never respected them, especially not Michael. To Green, Michael was just a kid playing at being a Don, and he treated him as such when Michael flew to Las Vegas to meet him. Michael's proposal was simple. He wanted to buy Green out. The Corleones needed full control of their Las Vegas operations, and Green's presence was no longer necessary. But Green laughed at him, openly mocking the idea. "You think you can just come out here and take over?" Green sneered. "The Corleones don't have that kind of muscle anymore. You're not your old man, kid." Michael remained expressionless. "We'll make you an offer," Green scoffed. "You don't buy me out, I buy you out. This town belongs to me." The insult hung in the air, but Michael gave no reaction. He simply stood up, straightened his jacket, and gave a polite nod. "I'll make my decision soon." Mo Green had already sealed his fate. The conflict in Las Vegas wasn't just about business, it was personal. Frito, Michael's older brother, had been living in Vegas under Green's influence, and he had aligned himself with the wrong side. During the meeting, Frito tried to downplay Michael's authority, even defending Green in front of him. It was a betrayal, subtle but undeniable. "Mike," Frito said, attempting to mediate, "you don't come to Las Vegas and talk to a man like Mo Green like that." Michael's gaze shifted to his brother, his face blank but his voice sharp. "Frito, you're my older brother and I love you, but never take sides against the family again. Ever." Frito shrank under Michael's stare, realizing he had overstepped. Michael had made his position clear. He was in charge, and there would be no more questioning his authority. Meanwhile, back in New York, the trap was closing around Don Barzini. Michael had been waiting for confirmation of his suspicions, and it came exactly as his father had predicted. Barzini arranged a meeting, using someone Michael trusted to set it up. The moment Michael received word, he knew the truth. His father had been right. It was always Barzini, but Michael didn't react. He didn't show his hand. Instead, he continued to play the role of the quiet, restrained Don, appearing to honor the peace while secretly making his own arrangements. His enemies believed they were closing in on him, but in reality, Michael was the one closing in on them. The final piece of the puzzle was Carlo Rizzi. Michael had long suspected that Carlo had betrayed Sonny, but he had never acted on it. Not yet. Carlo was Sonny's widow's husband, and Michael had promised his father he wouldn't harm him, at least not while Don Vito was alive. But now that his father was gone, there was no longer anything holding Michael back. Carlo had been getting comfortable again, believing that he had escaped punishment, but Michael was watching. He was waiting, and soon, Carlo would be dealt with, just like the rest. As the family prepared for Connie's baby's baptism, Michael remained silent, allowing the illusion of peace to continue. But behind the scenes, the Corleone family's most loyal assassins were preparing for war. Clemenza, Rocco Lampone, Al Neri, all were waiting for Michael's orders. The day of reckoning was coming. And when it arrived, it would not just be revenge. It would be the birth of a new era. The church was filled with light and solemnity as Michael Corleone stood at the baptismal font, holding his nephew in his arms. Dressed in a dark suit, his face calm and composed, he listened as the priest recited the sacred rites. The child, Connie and Carlo's son, remained unaware of the weight of the moment, of the world he had been born into, and of the decisions that had already sealed his father's fate. As the ceremony progressed, Michael responded to each question from the priest with unwavering certainty. "Do you renounce Satan?" "I do." While Michael pledged his devotion to God, his orders were being carried out across the city with brutal precision. The Corleone family had waited long enough. Now, they would strike all at once, wiping out their enemies in a single, coordinated attack. At that very moment, Al Neri, dressed as a police officer, approached the courthouse steps where Don Emilio Barzini was exiting with his bodyguards. Barzini, always careful, was surrounded by protection, but it wasn't enough. Neri moved with swift efficiency, raising his gun and firing 2 clean shots into Barzini's chest before finishing him off as he tried to crawl away. The great Don Barzini, the mastermind behind the Corleone family's troubles, was dead before he even realized what had happened. Elsewhere, Clemenza carried out his own assignment. Don Tartaglia, who had been little more than Barzini's puppet, was gunned down in his bed, his silk sheets stained with blood before he had a chance to wake. Don Cuneo was executed in a revolving door of a hotel lobby, his assassin walking away as if nothing had happened. Don Strachey, another rival, was eliminated mid-meeting, his screams cut short as bullets tore through him. In Las Vegas, Mo Green, still convinced of his own untouchable status, was lying on a massage table when his fate arrived. A single bullet pierced his eye, ending his reign over the city and ensuring that the Corleones would take complete control of the casino empire. The assassinations were carried out with clinical efficiency, each one designed to send a message. Michael Corleone was now the undisputed ruler of the underworld. Back in the church, the priest continued his ritual. Michael Corleone, do you believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth? I do. By the time Michael walked out of the church, the bloodshed was over. The Corleone family's enemies had been wiped from existence. The war was finished, but there was still one final betrayal to be addressed. Carlo Rizzi had been growing comfortable again, believing that he had been fully accepted back into the family. He had been given responsibility, allowed to handle some of the Corleone businesses, and he had convinced himself that his involvement in Sonny's murder had been forgotten. But Michael had never forgotten. He had simply been waiting for the right moment. When Michael returned home, he called Carlo into his office. The room, once his father's, now belonged to him. Carlo walked in cautiously, sensing that something was different, but still hopeful that he was safe. "Sit down, Carlo," Michael said, his voice steady. Carlo obeyed. He glanced around, looking for Tom Hagen, looking for some kind of reassurance. But Tom was not there. Only Michael, who sat behind the desk, his hands folded neatly in front of him. Michael spoke calmly, without anger. "You have to answer for Sonny." Carlo immediately began to panic. "Mike, I swear I had nothing to do with it." Michael nodded, almost sympathetically. "Don't insult my intelligence," he said softly. "Just tell me the truth. Who approached you?" "Barzini," Carlo hesitated, then finally admitted it. "It was Barzini. They came to me, they made me help them set Sonny up. But I swear, Mike, I didn't know they were going to kill him." Michael nodded again, as if he understood. "I want you to leave now. You're out of the family business. But don't worry, your wife and your children won't be harmed." Carlo exhaled in relief. "Thank you, Mike, thank you." Michael signaled for his men to escort Carlo outside to a waiting car. Clemenza was already sitting in the front seat. As soon as the doors closed, Clemenza turned and wrapped a thick garrote around Carlo's throat. Carlo kicked, struggled, but there was no escape. Within seconds, his body went limp, and the final traitor to the Corleone family was dead. Inside the house, Connie came rushing in, screaming at Michael. She had just learned what had happened to her husband, and she was hysterical, pounding her fists against his chest, calling him a murderer. Michael remained silent, unmoved, as his sister wept in front of him. Kay, standing nearby, watched in horror. She had known what Michael was capable of, but now, faced with the reality of it, she felt a growing dread. She waited until Connie was taken away, then finally asked the question that had been haunting her. "Michael, is it true?" Michael, looking into his wife's eyes, shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "That's not true. Don't ask me about my business, Kay." She hesitated, but she had to know. "Just this once, Michael, did you have Carlo killed?" Michael stared at her, then smiled slightly. "No." Kay exhaled, relieved. She turned away for a moment, reassured. Behind her, the office door slowly closed as Michael's capos entered. As she turned back, she caught a final glimpse of them kissing Michael's hand, addressing him with reverence. Don Corleone. The door shut, sealing Michael inside. The transformation was complete. The boy who once dreamed of a life outside the family had become the very thing he swore he never would be. Michael Corleone had won, but at what cost? The house was quieter now. The war was over. The enemies of the Corleone family were gone, and Michael sat at the head of it all. He had done what was necessary, fulfilling the vision his father had set in motion years ago. But where Don Vito Corleone had ruled with a mix of fear and respect, Michael had taken the family into something colder, something more absolute. There was no room for weakness anymore, no room for mistakes. Kay watched from a distance as the last of Michael's capos left his office. She had seen them kiss his hand and had heard them call him Don Corleone. The title was his now, fully and unquestionably. But what unsettled her most wasn't the power Michael wielded. It was how easily he had lied to her. He had looked her in the eyes and denied what she knew in her heart to be true. Carlo had been murdered on his orders. She hesitated in the hallway, waiting for Michael to call her in to explain everything. But the door remained closed. Inside, Michael stood alone, staring at the desk that had once belonged to his father. The office smelled of tobacco and old leather, the weight of history pressing down on him. He had avenged Sonny, destroyed the men who had conspired against the Corleones, and cemented their future in Las Vegas. He had even dealt with his own brother, Frito, ensuring that his disloyalty would never threaten the family again. But as he poured himself a drink, he realized something else. He had become truly alone. His father had built the Corleone empire to protect the ones he loved, to ensure his family's security. But in the end, Michael had secured power at the cost of the very thing his father had tried to preserve. Kay stood outside for a moment longer, then slowly turned away. She knew then that whatever Michael had once been, whoever he had once been, was gone. The door to the office remained closed, and Michael Corleone, the new Godfather, was left inside, alone in the empire he had built.